Welcome everyone to Chaucer's Books, author discussion with Professor John W.I. Lee, Associate Professor of History at the University of California at Santa Barbara. John has written a couple other tomes, one about Greek history as well as Persian history. And this one is John Wesley Gilbert, the first Black archaeologist. Welcome, and welcome, John.
Thank you. It's great to be here in Chaucer's with two of my dear friends. Maybe I should introduce them. This is Dr. Ernest Calandrianos, who I've known for many years through his association with the Greek community here, and Mr. Greg Pantages, also part of the Greek community. So it's really nice to have the two of you sitting right next to me here in Chaucer's.
So how do you guys know Professor Lee?
Well, my daughter, while in high school, had a hole in her schedule and was able to take a class at UCSB. It was offered by Professor Lee. And as long as there was space available, high school students could sit in. She sat through the whole class, front row. And what John did was take her under wing. Found out that she was a very good artist, had her do archaeological illustrations. And my daughter went on to UCLA, Phi Beta Kappa, and then University College London, got her master's. But the launching point is sitting right here. It just excited her interest and her focus, just phenomenal.
I met John primarily through his lectures to one of our organizations that the Greek Orthodox Church has, and thoroughly enjoyed them, but each time the relationship developed more and more and more. And that was before John started his family. And I gave him a few tips here and there as a retired pediatrician, and told him what to look forward to. And I think he took my advice because he has 3 children now.
They may wander into the screen at some point in our talk here.
That's great. That's the impromptu-ness of our little discussion here. John, I just got a couple questions. Gentlemen, feel free to jump in at any time. You've done extensive history on Greece and Persia. John Wesley Gilbert was an American, and I wanted to see what your initial response was, or your initial reaction to when you heard about John Wesley Gilbert.
Well, I didn't start out meaning to write a book about John Wesley Gilbert. My research field, as Greg and Ernest know, is ancient Greece, and I also worked in ancient Persia or Iran. And I was looking for a side project, and I learned that John Wesley Gilbert had been a student at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, Greece, which is the first American overseas research institute. And I thought, that's interesting. He was there in 1890, and I was there in 1997. 96, 97, I'll do a little project. It'll be quick, it'll be fast. And I ended up becoming absorbed by the history that I didn't know about. I didn't know about the history of African American education. I didn't know about the history of archaeology. Frankly, I didn't know about what Greece was like in the 1890s. And so little by little, that idea for an article became a book, actually, the book that's right here today.
Interesting. And you'd mentioned earlier that you actually took a journey with John Wesley Gilbert in your research, and I find that very interesting, because most, the stereotype of an academic is they're buried in the library doing research, but you actually trod the path that he walked. And I was hoping if you can give the overall view as well as certain memorable parts of your journey.
Well, I mean, as Ernest and Greg can tell you, there's nothing like being in the place to understand it better. Actually, Chrysanthe, your daughter, went to Greece and worked in Greece. So in my research, I ended up going to the places that Professor Gilbert had lived and worked. Greece, obviously, Providence, Rhode Island, where he was a student at Brown University, North Carolina and South Carolina, but above all, Augusta, Georgia, where he was raised in the 1870s and 80s. And so I made a connection with the local community, with the scholars of African American history and the museums. And so it became really a project, a book that grew out of the local community. And I say this again and again, maybe someone will have heard this elsewhere, but it's really the story of Augusta and of Augusta's African American community. I just kind of became the messenger for it. It's really, I'm just telling this a story that belongs to other people.
I noticed you have a bag from Augusta. If you can show that bag.
And my daughter Madeline's going to want to show up in a second in this video we're
Okay.
recording.
Yeah, there's a fuzzy in the lower corner. So.
Just as Chaucer's is the beloved independent bookstore of Santa Barbara, in Augusta, Georgia, there's the Book Tavern, which is right on Broad Street, and it's just down from some of the places where Professor Gilbert visited as a young man. And I was able to go there last month and give an in-person talk after 3 years away and see some of the people that have been part of my work there. So, yeah.
You actually absorbed some of his energy too. Like you had mentioned something about going to his bank and things like that.
So I start the book with after the Civil War, a bank which is called the Freedmen's Bank was set up to help emancipated slaves to build savings. And so I know where that bank was, the Freedmen's Savings Bank, on Broad Street in Augusta, down the street from that bookstore. And we actually have in the National Archives his bank register with his signature on it when he was 7 years old. So I kind of start the book with that as a way of showing how we can use these documents to tell the story of someone whose life might otherwise be lost.
And you felt his essence along the way, along your journey.
Yeah. I mean, there's a little boy's signature. You'll see my little boy wandering around here, who's almost 6 years old. And when the young Gilbert wrote his name there, he was about to turn 7.
Yeah. John Wesley Gilbert was a pretty amazing guy. I just was reading about him. I mean, he was an educator, a research guy. He was a minister, wasn't he? He seemed like a jack of all trades, that he was just whatever he did, he succeeded in. So if you could talk a little about him as a person.
Well, the first thing you should know is that Gilbert was born into slavery in rural Georgia in 1863. And after emancipation, he was able to go to school in Augusta, Georgia, and to attend a variety of schools, including Atlanta Baptist College, which is today Morehouse College, so the alma mater of Martin Luther King Jr. and many other famous Americans, and then Payne College in Augusta, Georgia, which was founded by a black Methodist denomination and a white Methodist denomination. So it was an interracial project working together. And then to Brown University. So he achieved as a student, as a scholar of Greek and Roman classics. He went to Greece as an archaeologist in 1890-91. He studied Hebrew and became a minister in his church, the Christian Methodist Episcopal, or the CME Church. And then he was active in the early civil rights movement in the 1900s. And if that wasn't enough, right? I mean, as you said, a jack of all trades. In 1911, he and a white Methodist bishop went to what was then the Belgian Congo to try to found a Methodist mission there. And he continued to teach and be active in his community until he died young in 1923. So in many different areas, he really contributed to his community, to his church, and to the national conversation.
So your book covers his entire life.
Yeah, and the funny thing is I thought I'll write a short article about Greece.
Yeah.
And I realized that I had to examine his whole life. And in the process, I learned about things I wouldn't have expected. I mean, the post-Civil War African American education, which I think is one of the greatest generations of U.S. history, where people who had been enslaved rose up and they just threw themselves into learning. I learned about that. I learned about the development of American archaeology in Greece, and both Ernest and Greg know that I've talked a lot of them about archaeology, but I learned about the early days when the archaeology was just developing. I learned about Greece in the 1890s, which is not really a topic that people think about unless they're very, very interested in modern Greek history. And I learned about the Belgian Congo and colonial activity in Africa. So, there are many different areas this took me into.
Talk about Gilbert's contributions to the architecture in Greece. What were his main contributions then?
So Gilbert was one of the first 50 Americans of any race, any ethnicity, any background to be in Greece doing professional archaeology.
Okay.
And I mentioned the American School of Classical Studies. He was one of the very first members of that school. So anybody who is an archaeologist of Greece, and I include myself in that, or has been to Greece, is walking in his footsteps in a way, and of the other early pioneers. And he was especially important in the development of archaeological survey. Like, we think about digging as archaeology, looking for stuff underground, but archaeologists also have to walk across the landscape looking for remains on top of the surface, so they can get an idea of the wider extent of a site, where buildings might have been, where there was habitation. And he was part of one of the very first American archaeological surveys in Greece or anywhere in the Mediterranean.
Wow.
Using scientific methods. They use the metric system, which is funny. I mean, nowadays we've abandoned the metric system, but in 1890-91 they thought we're all going to go metric real soon.
So, without revealing too much in the book, how did an African American gentleman from the South end up in Greece?
After the Civil War, the standard for black education and for white education was Greek and Latin classics. So if you wanted to be an educated person, you read Greek, you read Latin. For black Americans, the Greek was especially important because it was the language of the Bible. And we think about classics and reading ancient classical texts, but the Bible and Christianity are extremely important in African American intellectual life and religious culture, obviously religion. So it was kind of a natural place for him to go, was into studying Greek and Latin. And that interest led him at Brown University to start exploring the chance of actually going to Greece in person, and so he could see the ancient sites, and actually to learn modern Greek, because he became a decent speaker of the modern language as well. And again, if you know about Greece, you might know the ancient stuff, but the Greek language as it's spoken today and the culture of Greece, he was also very interested in that.
It sounds like you're very passionate about this, and it seemed like it all came together, but I'm sure it was hard work, a lot of research, and I'm wondering how long this took you to...
I started working on it in about 2015, 2016. I mentioned it was a side project. Again, Ernest and Greg have seen me through all these years and various meetings and talks, and it was a project that took me through the birth of two of our children. You might have seen them wandering around, the younger two, and Ernest, you talked about what it's like to be a father. I mean, it's trying to balance that with working on a book, and then of course coronavirus came, and that was a challenge. But I was able, many others were not able to finish books in this time, but thankfully I was able to finish it, and the book is out for people to enjoy. Yeah.
You mentioned a lot of people to thank, but the two gentlemen flank you were like kind of spiritual, would you call them spiritual guides of some sort?
This is my pareia. I don't know if you would call them quite that. I mean, there's a word in Greece is a pareia. It's people that you hang out with, that are around you. But the Greek community here is really wonderful and strong and interested in their community groups. And even though I am not Greek at all, right? So I'm Chinese from Hawaii. That being a Philhellene, the lover of Greek culture and Greek language and Greek history, it's been wonderful to have the Greek community here in town.
Gentlemen, has he reached honorary status? Greek citizen?
Long time ago.
Long ago.
What John is not is an armchair academic. And I believe in the bottom of your emails you say something to that effect. You don't study that way. For him to learn Greek as he has and be able to converse with my mother-in-law, who speaks very little English, and be kissing his hands and all that sort of stuff, he throws himself into it, but he throws himself into it with the humanity of that interest, that deep interest, and it's not an academic exercise. So he's a person that we love.
So what makes you marvel about his work the most? This is actually for both of you, if you want to feel free to.
What do I admire?
About John and his work, and
Well, I admire the most his zeal for teaching and and carrying on the Hellenic spirit to non-Hellenes, to non-Greek speaking or people who've lived in Greece. So I'm really moved by that, very motivated to hear him at every opportunity, because I know I'm going to learn something that I didn't know. And his broad academic background is just very, very appealing to me. And I was intrigued, by the idea that here is an Afro-American from the United States going to Greece, competing primarily, I would think, with the Brits and the Germans. It seems like they were the leaders, in archaeology, to my knowledge. So I'm very anxious to read his book. Each time I come here or I call, the book is sold out. So I'm anxious to read it and to see how he assimilated into the Greek culture the way he did.
Is there anything you wanted to add?
That's what I said is pretty much it, but again, it's the depth of study, and it's the humanity in the depth of study that really intrigues me. So as a person, John is phenomenal. Taking my daughter under wing, phenomenal. And in high school, to launch her, she was ready for college long before she graduated. Well, John took her by the hand and said, welcome. And it's that kind of mentorship that's rare, and heartfelt mentorship that's rare, but it's there. And this is the man right here. So.
And now, John, now that your project is completed, just your thoughts on your overall thoughts on the experience and what it's meant to you.
I started this book as a academic, intellectual study, and it led me to a whole new network of people. I never would have imagined that I would have friends in Augusta, Georgia, that I would become connected with a group of people that otherwise I would never have any link to. And I hope that this book has an impact for people who are interested in the history of archaeology, who are interested in the history of African American education and the enormous achievements of Black students and educators. But I also hope that it is an inspiring story. I mean, every time I made a new discovery, I was struck by, again, my boy's not here, right? A little boy who was expected not to go anywhere in life, who was expected to be a laborer or a delivery boy or someone, and instead he was able to reach the pinnacle of American education and to contribute and to be part of a movement for interracial harmony in the South, which we don't think of in this time. That was one of the main threads of his life. So I hope anybody who reads it will learn about this kind of hidden story, which is a real part of the complex history of our country, and of the history of Greece, and of the history of archaeology, and of the history of the Congo. I mean, it's kind of a story that touches all these different areas. So, no matter what a reader's interest might be, I hope that there'll be different avenues that might interest people in the book.
Well, John, I think you covered it all in your book. Congratulations to you, and I wish you the best for your book.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank Ernest and Greg for being here for this impromptu conversation.
Thank you.